Hi, everybody. We're super excited to be here today, and we want to give a quick shout out to the event organizers for putting this on and allowing us to share our work with you today. Like they said, I'm Eileen, this is Eryn, and we've been working on the Division of Water Rights gap analysis for the past little while, and it was published in August of 2018. And so what this analysis was all about was essentially taking an inventory of the current measurement network that's out in the basin right now. And we worked with a lot of different local stakeholders in order to understand where the gaps in the monitoring network are and how to address those gaps. The idea being if we can fill the gaps with new measurement or updated measurement, then not only do we increase data access and transparency, but we can also increase our ability to make informed decisions about our watershed because we can't manage what we don't measure. And so we're gonna blast through this today, but please know that all of this information, and especially in more detail, is online and it's available, and we'll throw a link up for it so you can have it all. But with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So to do this analysis, we essentially had 3 different deliverables we were working through. The first was to evaluate the existing stream and diversion measurement network that's out there in the basin currently. And we also went around and documented how water is moving in and out of these systems. The next thing we did was talk with local stakeholders about where they perceive the gaps in the current measurement network to be and how best to address those gaps, be it with a new measurement device or an update. So like this could be the addition of telemetry to a site that's out there so you can have real-time information, or perhaps maybe there's a submerged flume and it needs to be reset for good measurement. The final thing we did was to create a prioritized list of new and updated measurement infrastructure for the basin. And this is to serve a lot of different purposes, including research and planning, as well as distribution and delivery. So today we're going to go through this primarily in the context of the Weber Basin and talk about the systems that we looked at, talk a little bit about the materials that we developed and are available online, as well as kind of the different gap types that fell out in the measurement network and how that all led into our prioritized list. So in the Weber Basin, we took a look at East Canyon Creek, Chalk Creek, Lost Creek, Ogden River, and its upper reaches, as well as the Weber River main stem. And so for all of these different systems, we developed flow balance diagrams, which are these stick-and-line diagrams that show the ins, the outs, where the reservoirs are located, different mechanics that are happening like waste gates or canal return locations, things like that. Most importantly, we had a lot of local stakeholders interact with us and make these diagrams even better. And so they told us a lot of different information, corrected locations of canals returns, as well as told us information about how these systems work and special things that you need to know if you're gonna be working inside of these systems or researching them. And so it's really great to have all of those insights from primarily the river commissioners, water managers, and the people who work with these systems every day. So that was one great product that came out of it. The other one was gauging information worksheets. And essentially what these are documents that tell us about the measurement infrastructure that's in the basin currently. So that's things like gauge status. Does it have telemetry or not? What's the condition of the station? Is it good? Is it bad? What's the type of device that's sitting out there? Is it a flume? Is it a bubbler? Things like that. So that was all really great information to have. That was again reviewed by local stakeholders. Finally, we also developed Gantt charts and data histograms, which I won't get into today, but essentially those summarize the data availability and quality from these stations. So using all of this information and talking with the local experts and reiterating them to get the best product that we could that was most accurate, 3 different gap types fell out that we could look at. And so the first one was existing measurement infrastructure quality and completeness gaps. And essentially for every stream and diversion measurement device, we identified 5 different characteristics of the device that we could consider gaps or not. So the first one was device type, the next one was device condition, telemetry status, the data record interval, and data record consistency. We're only going to talk about a couple of them today, but for device type, this one essentially refers to, is the device that's sitting out there and measuring a canal or stream sufficient for the conditions in which it's sitting? And so that's something that the Division of Water Rights helped us refine and understand. And then also, do we even actually know what the device sitting out there is? And that's where the metadata piece comes in. Some of these were installed a long time ago, and sometimes historical records can be a little bit confusing. Another thing we looked at was the public data record interval and consistency. So this refers to the record that's available to you, that's available to me, to everybody in this room, and what is the interval at which that data is made available to us. Because oftentimes you can change how often a device is collecting information, and perhaps it would be more useful to have sub-hourly data available rather than daily. So the next type of gap that fell out were the stakeholder-identified gaps. So we had a lot of people participate, as you can see on the list, but essentially over 160 people gave us feedback on a survey form or in meetings about where they perceived gaps in the measurement network. And so this was things like where they thought new measurement should go, that there isn't currently a measurement device, but we need one to understand the water movement better, or perhaps where there was an existing station and it needed to be updated, like the addition of telemetry. And so we were super grateful to have a bunch of people who work in these systems every single day tell us about where the needs were. The final gap type that came out were potential spatial gaps. And the reason that we had this gap type was because we wanted to be able to account for other things happening in the watershed that weren't initially captured by our first two gap types. So this includes things like land use type, where the major confluences are, all the different kind of complicated things that are happening inside of a watershed, and all of this information was summarized at the Huck 12 scale. And the one that we have highlighted here is the presence of dry dams in the Weber Basin and across the Great Salt Lake Basin. And essentially, what a dry dam is that there's the full legal right, as well as the capacity of a canal to take the full flow of that stream or river and leave the downstream dry. And so knowing where those locations are, as it's a special mechanism in some of these river systems, is important when we think about measurement. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to Eryn.
Shorter than Eileen. All right, so I'm going to really quickly try to talk about some of the results of the study. And like Eileen said, all of this information, we'll link it later, but it's available in a big report that's focused on the Great Salt Lake Basin as a whole. The data is available, as is the report, but the results I'm going to talk about here are specific to the Weber Subbasin. And so for the first gap type, the existing measurement infrastructure quality and completeness gaps, we looked at the information that we collected in gauging information worksheets and summarized these in pie charts to identify gaps. And of the 30 stream gauges that we evaluated in the Weber River Subbasin, there really weren't a lot of gaps associated with these devices. They're in pretty good quality. The gaps that did pop out were there were a handful of gauges that had a daily or greater time step in the public data record, and there were also a handful of gauges, 13% of 30 is 4 gauges that had either insufficient metadata to describe the device type or an insufficient device type as determined by the DWRI. The condition of the gauges was overwhelmingly considered good. These gauges are telemetered, and there are minimal interruptions greater than a year or greater in duration in the public data record. We evaluated 130 diversion gauges within the Weber Basin as well, and there were more gaps associated with these gauges. Notably, about 2/3 of the gauges, the diversion gauges in the Weber Subbasin, were lacking telemetry. And so that's the top right pie chart there. That goes hand in hand with another major gap that fell out for diversion gauges, which was the data record interval was about 75% of the time available at a daily or greater time step, which is important for real-time decision making. And also about 1/3 of the gauges were determined to have a gap type for the device type. Overwhelmingly, however, regardless of the device type, gauges were considered to be in pretty good condition, and there were minimal year or longer gaps in the public data record. For the second gap type, which was stakeholder identified gaps, we had really great response to our survey from local stakeholders, and stakeholders identified about 175 gaps in the existing measurement infrastructure network. These included recommendations for new infrastructure, updates to existing infrastructure, and locations where stakeholders wanted to emphasize the continued funding of existing infrastructure. Most of these submissions, however, were for new installations. And you can break up this information in lots of different ways, but some other ways we summarized it were most of the recommendations were for stream gauges rather than diversion gauges. And the Division of Water Rights broke all the submissions into categories to determine what overall purpose they serve, whether that's research and planning, distribution delivery, or both. And so in the bottom green pie chart, the Division of Water Rights determined that most of the gauges recommended in the Weber Basin served a research and planning need. Spatially, the trend that we picked out here is that most of the recommendations by stakeholders were clustered around the Great Salt Lake shoreline as well as along the Weber River main stem. And while the reservoirs are not pictured on top of this map here, that's where a lot of the recommendations are clustered, is around the reservoirs. And so all of the maps and things that we're going to show are available in an ARC Online format, which is a clickable map that's publicly available online, where you can go in and see the agency that submitted these recommendations, the justification for the reason why they suggested a gauge in these locations, which is really useful if you're an agency looking to fund a install of a new device. Say, you can see where there may be partners for common interest of installing a gauge in those locations. So the third gap type was our potential spatial gaps. And so what we did was we had these 8 spatial metrics that Eileen talked about, and we applied. They're all created by equations at the HUC-12 scale for different spatial features. And we applied a threshold to these equations basically to flag sub-watersheds as having a gap for each of these 8 metrics. And we summarized, or took a sum of how many gaps existed in each HUC-12. And in the Weber Basin, the maximum number of potential spatial gaps in a single HUC-12 was 4. So that's the more red color is the more number of spatial gaps per HUC-12. We only did this for primary systems, so that's why some of the HUC-12s are shown in gray. And generally speaking, closer you get to Great Salt Lake, or the closer you are to a major river, so the Ogden and the Weber River, the more potential spatial gaps there are, and the farther up the watershed you go, the less potential spatial gaps there were. Really quickly, I'm going to talk about how we combined all of these things together to prioritize measurement infrastructure gaps in the basin as a whole. Our method is equation-based, and it's detailed really well in our report and our materials online. But basically what we did was we created an objective framework that combined all 3 of these gap types to classify HUC-12s as high, medium, or low priority for measurement, either installation or updates to existing infrastructure. And so in the map you can see, which is shown for the basin as a whole, the trend that came out was HUC-12s that were clustered along the major 3 tributaries to Great Salt Lake were classified as high priority for, it's no really surprise, for measurement improvement. And additionally, HUC-12s that were upstream of major reservoirs in the basin also came out as high priority, whether or not they were on these major river systems or not. And what we have available online is this information both spatially in the ARC Online map, as well as in a spreadsheet format where you can see what HUC-12s were identified as what level priority, and the gauges that fell within them that had gaps that we identified previously, and the stakeholder identified gaps, how they adopted the priority level of the HUC-12 they fell within to emphasize these locations for either new or updated measurement improvement. And so this framework was meant to be adaptable. If you have any questions about it, please let us know. But yeah, so this was just the way that we did it. We know that it could be done many ways. And if Eileen and I are good at anything, it's disclaiming what we do. So, so yeah, take that with what you will. All of this information, like we've said, is available online. We have this QR code that you can scan that links you to an online public repository hosted on HydroShare. And so on there you can find our report, which is 700 pages long, but the main body is 30 pages. Everything's in there. So the system materials, the flow balance diagrams for all the primary systems, all the Gantt charts, data histograms, all of that stuff, all the figures that we've shown focus on the basin as a whole. There's also a link to the ARC Online map that I've been referencing, which is a clickable interface of all of these different gap types and the prioritization and all of these things. Locations of gauges is useful to know. We have a document in there that defines all the layers and the attributes associated with that map, as well as a geodatabase with all those layers as well if you want to just download it yourself and use it in ARC on your own. We also have provisional materials created for Great Salt Lake, and Eileen's going to talk maybe in a second if we have time about our continued work on Great Salt Lake specifically. And like I said, the prioritization results are available in spreadsheet format in the online repository as well as big images of everything that we have in the report, because that's just easier to look at. And so Eileen's going to talk a little bit about how this information has already been used and work that we're doing now.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give a big shout out to the Division of Water Rights as well as the USGS in partnership with the Bureau of Reclamation. There are a lot of other entities working to install gauges in the basin and across the GSL basin as a whole. But this is just a highlight of a few of them that they've installed so far, as well as their planned installs in the basin. And so we just wanted to highlight their work. They've been moving really fast to get this infrastructure in. And yeah, this is the list I have as of November 30th, 2023, so I'm sure more have gone in since that. As a final note, we just wanted to tell you a little bit about some upcoming work that we have related to this. We didn't get a good chance to dive deep into the lakeshore area during our gap analysis. And so now we've had the time to dig deeper, talk about water movement around the lakeshore and near the lakeshore, and also work with the managers down there to understand how water is moving and when. And so we're working on that project right now, and there's more to come, but just wanted to make you all aware of it, and please let us know if you have any questions about the upcoming work. With that, I'm gonna go ahead and leave the QR code up for anybody who wants it, and hopefully we have some time for questions, but if not, that's okay.
It's a long walk up here. Just a quick question about the data infrastructure on the new gauges. Is that data being stored with USGS, or kind of what's the data platform for that?
Yeah, so every new gauge that's coming online from the Division of Water Rights and also from USGS is starting to be put up on their websites. Sometimes it's a little bit slow to get things up and going, so some of them are only showing stage readings at this point and don't have full rating curves developed as of yet, but they are actively coming online, and they have some teams working really, really hard to get those up quickly.